President Trump was hosting many of the nation's governors at the White House yesterday when the U.S. Supreme Court dealt a major blow to his agenda, ruling Trump cannot use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act as a blank check to impose sweeping global tariffs. According to a White House official in the room, when President Trump received the news, he told the governors the ruling was disgraceful. But when the president lashes out, Democratic governors are doing victory laps. In a letter to the president, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker writes, "Your tariff taxes wreaked havoc on farmers, enraged our allies, and sent grocery prices through the roof. This morning, your hand-picked Supreme Court justices notified you that they are unconstitutional." He's also included an invoice for $8.6 billion, demanding $1,700 for each of Illinois' 5.1 million households, arguing that Trump's tariffs functioned as an illegal tax on state residents. Joining us now is Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, who serves as the chair of the Democratic Governors Association. He was not at yesterday's breakfast, but is in D.C. for the National Governors Association winter meeting. Governor, thanks for so much for being at the table this morning. You were one of the plaintiffs in this case. How did you celebrate last night?
Oh, the way we always celebrate in Kentucky, with bourbon. But this was such a big victory, both for democracy, because the Supreme Court actually did its job, but also for our people. So tariffs are a tax on the American people. Americans and American businesses have paid 90% of all of those tariffs. And the president can't unilaterally tax the American people. That's what the Supreme Court said. And now I think our people are owed their money.
Are you going to be invoicing the president?
We should. When we look at how hard it is to get by right now, everybody talking about rent or their mortgage, talking about groceries. This was another $1,000+ of costs on every Kentuckian. The president made life harder, and it's time that he stops. You know, regardless of what he thinks the remedy is, he's at the bottom of the hole. So stop digging. Don't continue those costs.
When you're talking about affordability, essentially, I want you to hear what President Trump said about affordability on Thursday.
I added $9 trillion, and your retirement accounts and 401ks are at the highest level they've ever been. And then I have to listen to the fake news talking about affordability. Affordability. Do you notice? What word have you not heard over the last 2 weeks? Affordability. Because I've won. I've won affordability.
Really? There's so many lies in that, because we've been talking about affordability this entire time. But it's also important to note that many Americans don't have a 401k. Many of them don't have a retirement account. So even the folks that he's talking about that he says he has helped, those are not the everyday people that live in Kentucky. What do you have to say to the president as we go into these midterms about how he views affordability, which seems to be a foregone conclusion for him?
So I'm the head of the Democratic Governors Association. I'm leading 36 races across the country, and I want him to go to every single one of those states and say what he just said. Yeah. If he thinks he has won affordability and the American people aren't struggling, bring that on. Campaign in each of those states and say it, because it's not the reality. You know, the American people are desperate for leaders that can make life just a little bit easier. They're not asking for a lot. They just want to be able to pay their bills and maybe every couple of years take their kids on the same vacation they went on. You think about the average age of someone being able to afford their first house is now 40. That's not a sustainable America. That's the American dream starting to trickle away. So we are going to elect governors that are going to build housing, that are going to bring prices down, are going to bring in jobs with better wages to make that life just a little bit easier.
You sound bullish on Democratic gubernatorial candidates. Any few races you want to call right now?
Well, we are going to protect our incumbents across the board. We're going to reelect Katie Hobbs in Arizona, where the Republicans are coming. We're going to flip a lot of states. You're going to see us in Georgia, Nevada, Iowa, Ohio. But we are ready to play anywhere, to deliver that next John Bel Edwards, to make sure that we can deliver good leadership that believes in health care, that believes in rural health care. We're looking at the big, ugly bill that may close 35 rural hospitals in Kentucky. Not only will that eliminate health care in those regions, it's the largest payroll in each of those regions. So it shuts down. So does the restaurant, the coffee shop, the bank, the insurance agency. We are about to see widespread economic devastation in rural America. So electing more Democratic governors helps us push back.
Governor, I noticed that when you were rattling off states where you were a little bullish, you popped up when you said Iowa. Just notice that there are a lot of people who view you as someone who could potentially run for president of the United States. And I'm just wondering, in listening to what you were saying about what governors should be doing and the folks that you are hoping to get elected, I'm wondering, what does the Democratic Party need to do to get voters to believe that those Democratic candidates have what it takes to, as you say, make their lives better?
Now, the first thing we've got to do is show up. We've got to show up everywhere. Democrats stop going to certain parts of our country or certain parts of our states, and we've got to be talking to everyone because everyone's struggling right now. And 2024 taught us that people will even vote for someone they know is cruel if they think that person might do a little bit more to make their life easier. I think our candidates need to spend 80% of their time focused on things that matter to 100% of the American people. Those are good jobs with wages where you can afford what you need. They're the next doctor's appointment, the roads and bridges you drive, the school you drop your kids off at, and whether you feel safe in your community. Our candidates need to talk like normal human beings. Push out that advocacy speak. In Kentucky, we didn't lose people to substance use disorder. We lost them to addiction. And then we need to share our authentic why. You all have heard me talk about my faith, and that's how I make decisions. It's what drives me. And that's not everybody's authentic why, but in the age where people want to know you, the age of social media where people post their own videos, they want to know what drives you, not for the decision you've already made, but the one you may make in the future.
What is that other 20%? Because I imagine the kinds of things that are in there are the things that most people or the Democratic Party is trying to figure out if there are kitchen table issues, right? They're like LGBTQ issues, issues of racial justice. You are someone who has thread the needle on that in your state, both in kind of action in the bills that you have vetoed that have come from Republicans, but also in rhetoric. How can the party make sure that the choices before Democratic primary voters in 2028, whether you're in that primary or not, don't have to decide between what we naturally think of kitchen table issues and jobs and social issues?
That other 20% are your convictions. It's what you believe in. I'm going to stand up against discrimination in any form, regardless of how it polls in Kentucky or anywhere else, because it's the right thing to do. So I vetoed every anti-LGBTQ bill that's come across my desk in Kentucky. I've vetoed every anti-DEI bill that's come across my desk in Kentucky. And I've done that because it's the right thing to do. And you only get so much time in this job. You ought to be doing the right thing every time. And I will tell you, the right thing is typically the right thing politically, at least if you're willing to explain it, because people like people of conviction, even if they maybe disagree with it. But as we talked about, I think the last time I was on your show, you got to respect voters enough to explain your why. Most of those bills that I veto is because I believe all children are children of God, of equal dignity, that we're supposed to be treating right, and nobody should be discriminated against or picked on.
And, Governor, before we're out of time, I want to get back quickly to the conversation about speaking to different types of voters and elevating your profile in order to do that. You did to be frank, gorgeous spread with Vogue. Gorgeous house, gorgeous family, very cute dog.
Only time the dogs actually looked at the camera.
I'm wondering, because these kinds of profiles do not come without controversy. Beto O'Rourke famously was on the cover of Vanity Fair, shot by Annie Leibovitz, and some people viewed it as sort of the death knell in his, at one point, ascendant political presidential campaign. What was the calculus in deciding whether or not to do this Vogue spread?
Well, I was only going to do it if I got to be me, if my family was in it, because they're part of my everyday life. I've governed through COVID. I've governed through 15 federally declared weather disasters, tough times. And every time I've gotten to come home to two of the greatest kids, to the greatest wife, and a dog that kind of likes me. She really loves my wife. And so whatever journey I'm on, I'm going to be true to who I am. I'm comfortable in my own skin. I'm okay if people disagree or even dislike me. But I want to make sure that the American people see exactly who I am.
Joining me here in studio, we have Catherine Rampell, economics editor at The Bulwark and, of course, co-host of the Weekend Primetime right here on MS Now. Also joining us, we have Ankush Khardori, former federal prosecutor, now senior writer with Politico magazine. Can I ask you quickly what we heard from the president there, Catherine? What did the president mean when he said he can destroy another country?
That is not an economic question, but I think he means that he can do whatever he wants. He thinks that he is not constrained.
He said that. I can do whatever I want.
He is not constrained by the Constitution or Congress or inspector generals or, for that matter, the Supreme Court, as it turns out.
So what do you see as the immediate impact of this ruling, the going from 10% to 15% within a matter of 24 hours?
The real question is why he didn't do 15% yesterday, honestly, because the law that he is referencing to impose these new tariffs, to replace the tariffs the Supreme Court said that he cannot impose, that allows for a maximum of 15% taxes,
right.
Tariffs or taxes
right.
for the next 150 days. So I don't know why he didn't do it to begin with. He's not a guy who's known exactly for being a policy wonk or for doing his homework. So maybe he just said 10% sounded really nice. And then somebody told him, psst, you can actually make it higher. And he did. I don't know. But, you know, the Supreme Court really handed him a gift here. He did not have to impose tariffs of 10%, 15%, any other amount. He could have just said, you know what, we are going to accept this gift from the Supreme Court, which is effectively cutting taxes for Americans and then
run with it.
And run with it.
Yeah.
And the refunds that will be due or should be due, that's a whole other question, to the businesses that have already remitted these taxes. That's going to be a nice shot in the arm, a nice stimulus for them. He could have just said, thank you. I appreciate it. We are now going to have our golden age of the economy that I have been promising because we are going to get our boot off your necks. And instead, of course, he decided to try to reconstitute those taxes and effectively punish not just foreign countries, as you pointed out, but American consumers as well.
For sure. Ankush, is this new tariff move by the president constitutional or will it face legal challenges?
Well, look, I and many other folks have been following this issue, expected this Section 122 tariff to kick in immediately. Catherine's right. It could have been immediately gone up to 15%, as well as all the other authorities they've been referencing. The problem, there may very well be challenges. One is that the statute refers to a balance of payment deficits as the triggering mechanism for this tariff authority. Trump has referred to trade deficits. Balance of payment deficits are not exactly the same thing as trade deficits. Now, I'm sure Catherine could speak more articulately about that than I could, but it's just to say that I could envision a challenge where someone says, well, no, actually, you can't justify even these tariffs on the theory that you've articulated. But trade courts tend to be quite deferential and could even be deferential on an interpretive question like that in favor of Trump. But that's just to say it is a potentially litigable issue. And then, of course, there's going to be this question about, well, what happens after the 5-month period runs up? Because this provision only allows a 150-day period without Congress re-upping it. And I think Trump maintained a little bit of wiggle room on the question of whether he can just re-up 150-day successive periods without having to go to Congress. Now, I think if we take a very big step back from all this, I think that, I think Catherine zeroed in on an important point here, which is this is now sort of firmly, I think, back into the political policy realm. Trump has been claiming for the last year, absurdly to my mind, that he has this unlimited unilateral authority that somehow Congress gave to him in this tiny little statute. All of his authority for imposing tariffs comes from the Constitution and congressional authority. That means if he goes forward with any of these tariffs, even today's, it is only going to be possible with the implicit blessing of Republicans in Congress. They could stop and repeal any or all of the tariff authority he's going to be using.
There's a big question whether they will do that, and it's because of this reason, Catherine, because if we look at the numbers of disapproval, it's 64% right now of Americans who say, we disapprove of the way Donald Trump is handling tariffs, likely because consumers are paying the bulk for them. It is not foreign countries, as the president has insisted repeatedly. So how might this ruling change the overall dynamic?
Yeah, it turns out Americans are upset about affordability. Gee, I wonder why they might then disapprove of policies that make things less affordable, which is exactly the case here. Again, tariffs are taxes. There have been a bunch of studies from the Congressional Budget Office, from researchers at the New York Fed and elsewhere, finding that the vast majority of these tariff costs are being passed along to regular Americans. 90%, 95%. You know, there's some margin of error there, but it's the vast majority of these costs. So, of course, Americans are upset by this. And in fact, there were numbers that came out today from the Yale Budget Lab finding that if you include these new 15% tariffs from today, I think the typical American household is paying something like an additional $700 over the course of just that 150-day period because of the totality of Trump's tariffs. So, yeah, Americans do not like these tariffs. They are making life much more expensive. And I don't understand why Trump is deciding to double down on all of this, given that people hate them. They are expensive. They don't really seem to be achieving whatever concessions he claimed they would be achieving. And the other piece of all of this is that his negotiations with other countries, that are supposed to extract these painful concessions from other countries, maybe they could have worked out this cudgel would have been effective anyway, when Trump could, on a whim, impose tariffs. But the fact is, these additional tariffs that he's putting in place, to reconstitute or backfill the ones that were vacated by the Supreme Court.
Deemed illegal.
Yeah, right. Deemed illegal, unconstitutional, in fact. Those require a lot more process. They're not something that he can just do a tweet, despite the fact that he seems to have done one today. It's just a tweet. There's no force of law that I'm aware of. Maybe Ankush can explain whether this is actually a binding message. But my understanding is that all of the other tariff authorities that he has require a lot more process and bureaucracy and notice and comment and hearings and things like that. So they're not as effective of a tool for the president can't just deploy it as he likes because he's mad that Brazil is being mean to his buddy Bolsonaro, or he's mad at Canada for having an ad that uses the words of Ronald Reagan. There has to be actual due process here. And so it will be less effective.
So, Ankush, we have Trump, who has responded to this ruling. He's gotten into personal attacks on the justices that he appointed, and the traditionally conservative Wall Street Journal says it was arguably the worst moment of his presidency. Here's some of that.
I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country.
Justices Gorsuch and Barrett, are you surprised in particular by their decision today? And do you regret nominating them?
I don't want to say whether or not I regret. I think their decision was terrible. Yeah. I think it's an embarrassment to their families. You want to know the truth, the two of them.
Is this presidential public shaming of Supreme Court justices unprecedented?
I've never seen anything like that before. I think it goes way further than any kind of presidential public disapproval of the Supreme Court in recent years. It was very obnoxious, obviously, the way he spoke about people. But, I think the thing to take away would be a couple things. First of all, their legal position was very weak and bad from the start. I've been writing columns for literally over a year about how problematic this policy and legal rationale was. So the fact that he managed to get any justices on board is like a reflection of the partisanship that is prevailing at it should have been 9-0 against the tariffs. And so, I think, as we were talking about, Catherine, just very briefly, sort of the trade deals and negotiations, one thing I just would like people to bear in mind is that for the last year plus, the president and his top advisors have been going all over the world, making threats against our allies and adversaries based on an illegal tool, one that was plainly illegal, a mini trade specialist. They kept going after court told them that they were wrong. Republicans in Congress would have been up in arms if a Democratic president had behaved like that with pending litigation and a controversial policy initiative that has been widely disliked by the American public the whole time. This has been a really remarkable, I think, political and diplomatic debacle that I think we're only going to start to feel the effects of. And last but not least, we're in the middle of the midterm season here. So, he's going to be doing all of these things. A bunch of the investigations that Catherine alluded to have already begun. These things are going to start to kick in. But it is going to become very apparent to American voters, I think, that the tariffs are there because of Trump and the Republican Party by November.
Ankush, do you think he persisted because he relied on the Supreme Court to do as they have done so often, particularly through shadow docket rulings, They agree with him.
Well,
he expected them.
I'll do you one better. The Supreme Court immunity ruling, right? Three of the judges who sided against him yesterday sided with him, granting him criminal immunity. A terrible historic mistake and a god-awful decision. But you can see why he might have thought, oh, the same crew that effectively bailed me out of prison will help me out here. Now, it is a reflection of how ridiculous this legal argument was that he could not keep even that coalition together.
Quick answer to what happens with the trade deals. Are they locked in? Are countries going to get refunds?
Are countries going to get refunds?
Countries.
Well, no. I mean, the tariffs have been remitted by U.S. importers. So the whole idea that other countries were paying the tariffs was nonsense from the get-go. They are literally paid by American companies, or companies that are bringing things to our shores. Now, maybe some of those other countries or companies in other countries, suppliers in other countries might have decided to agree to share some of the burden. You know, maybe they would lower some of their costs. They're not going to get any of that back. Okay. But the actual money that was paid by American companies on our shores, and then they would either pass along those costs to their downstream companies, like consumers, or they would try to work out a deal with companies abroad. But either way, no, they're not getting the money back.
It's a big no. Okay. No, in terms of no way do I not want to have you guys on again. Thank you so much. Ankush Khardori and Catherine Rampell.
Joining me now, of course, is my friend, Judge Michael Luttig, a former judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. Judge Luttig, welcome back to the show. I had chills listening to your speech last week. You invited me to be there for it, in which you issued a calling that now is the time to use all tools at our disposal to fight tyranny, not simply voting every 2 years.
Ali, thank you for having me on this morning. For the first time in 10 years, Ali, I not only have hope, today I have confidence that America is going to prevail and long endure. Today is another America time of testing. That time has come to us, our generation. And I believe that February 2026 will be remembered as the turning point in America, when Americans once again declared their independence from tyrannical rule. America has had several times of testing, as you alluded to, times that have tried men's souls, in the words of Thomas Paine. The most notable, of course, being at its founding 250 years ago, but also at the time of the Civil War and the Civil Rights era in the 1960s and 70s, and now today. At every time of testing, Americans summoned the courage to speak truth to power in order originally to secure their liberty and their freedoms and their self-government. And then thereafter, over the past 250 years, to retain and resecure their liberty and their government of the people, by the people, and for the people. These several times of testing, Ali, over the past 250 years have now all converged into the times in which we are living in America today. Indeed, they've converged into this very day, even into this very month of February 2026.
Judge, I want to go back to 2021, January 5th, in which you posted a tweet. It was the first of a 7-tweet thread in which you said the only responsibility and power of the vice president under the Constitution is to faithfully count the Electoral College votes as they have been cast. Seems like an obvious thing to say, but that was an important message. That was directed to support Mike Pence in not doing Donald Trump's bidding. That tweet perhaps may have changed the course of history. You paid a price for that. And I think that's important because right now Americans are realizing that in order to uphold their democracy, and I agree with you, I'm hopeful, but they are understanding that there is a price to pay. We've already seen 2 lives lost in those shootings in Minneapolis. You paid a price for saying something that was just obvious.
Well, Ali, that's really beside the point. The real point is that almost anyone in America could have tweeted the very same words that I tweeted. So basic was the proposition that under the Constitution of the United States of America, an incumbent president cannot ignore the will of the American people and attempt to overturn that election. But it was Mike Pence, then Vice President of the United States of America, who was the hero of that day and of those times in America. It was really his courage that stood up for the United States of America and all that we've ever held dear.
Let me ask you about this ruling yesterday from the Supreme Court. It was on a narrow issue of tariffs and taxation, and one that no one was particularly surprised at it evolved in the way it should have evolved. Donald Trump thereafter had a remarkable press conference. You spoke to the New York Times about this, in which you said, before the entire world, it was the president's most spectacular display yet of his utter disrespect for the Constitution and his contempt for the Supreme Court of the United States. Tell me about what you saw happening yesterday.
Well, Ali, I, like millions and millions of others around the world, I watched every second of that spectacular display by the President of the United States. And it's really the words before the entire world in that New York Times quote that we should focus on. Before the entire world, the President of the United States held that hour-long press conference in which he displayed spectacularly, yet again, his utter disrespect and contempt for the Constitution and for the Supreme Court of the United States in the plainest language, unequivocal language, frightening language to the world and to the American people. I believe that that press conference, not the Supreme Court's decision and not what could have been the president's response to that decision, but the press conference that will define this president and his presidency for all of American history.
You talk about this disrespect for the court. It was also pretty personal. He issued disrespect toward the justices themselves, including two whom he had appointed. You've talked about this for a long time. There are implications to using this sort of language about judges. And we have seen threats to judges. Amy Coney Barrett's family has suffered because of this. You feel that that's an important line that the president keeps crossing?
Yes, with emphasis on keeps crossing. You know, as I said publicly and even on your show a little over a year ago, on his first day back in office, the president declared war on the rule of law and the federal judiciary. And he's viciously waged that war against the federal judiciary in particular every day since, up to yesterday. Vicious, unprecedented in all of American history. And it may be unprecedented in the history of the world, Ali. I can't imagine any other world leader speaking of that country's Supreme Court in the way that the President of the United States did yesterday. It was vicious, ad hominem. I mean, he called the court a disgrace. You know, he even went so far by the end of the press conference to say that the families of the justices who ruled against him should be ashamed of their family member. I believe that's correct because when I heard those words, Ali, I I just shivered for America.
So when I asked you last week about what to do for America, everybody, has a different way of doing this, but you did believe that at this point, voting is, as you said to me, voting is necessary but not sufficient. And when I said, what's the extra part, you said that we're going to have to take to the streets en masse. We're going to have to protest peacefully, calmly, nonviolently, but that is now something that is heard and understood that is important.
Yes, that gets back to the way I described the moment at the top of this show and my remarks to the City Bar of New York. It's because of the confluence of the events of this past month in particular, the horrific events in Minneapolis, the Super Bowl halftime show protesting Donald Trump's immigration and deportation policies, and then the tariff decision yesterday and the president's press conference on the Supreme Court's tariff decision. This particular confluence of events over the past month has brought America to, and I believe beyond, the tipping point. And what has happened through all of American history when Americans have been brought to that tipping point and beyond? Well, we know it began with the founders of this great nation. They summoned the courage to dissent, to protest, if you will, and even to wage war against the tyranny that beset the founders at that time. Waged a war, the Revolutionary War, Allie, to secure the freedoms and liberties and the rights and the self-government that we have today embodied in the Constitution of the United States. And then thereafter, in the Civil War, same thing. Americans summoned up their courage to protest and dissent from injustice. And then so again in the 60s and 70s, led by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Every moment in the past 250 years when America itself was at a crossroads, at a moment in which, as Abraham Lincoln said, America might no longer endure, Americans have risen. They've summoned the courage from within, from deep within, to dissent and protest against the evil, whether from within or from without, of the United States of America. That's what I believe we are witnessing today. And that's why I said at the top of the show, for the first time in 10 years, Allie, I have not just hope, but I have the belief that we have come to the turning point and that America and Americans are going to answer the call from our founders and ancestors to defend the United States of America.
Joining me now is New Mexico Congresswoman Melanie Stansbury. She serves on the House Oversight Committee. Welcome back. It's good to see you, my friend. So we have lawmakers, some of them are using the example of former Prince Andrew to emphasize prominent figures in the U.S. are also not above the law. And you said, quote, if a prince can be held accountable, so can a president. Do you expect Andrew's arrest to move the needle toward accountability for others?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think the unprecedented arrest and investigation of the former Prince Andrew sets an example not only for the world, but especially for the United States, where we have a president that is not only refusing to act on the Epstein files, but engaged in a direct cover-up, and whose DOJ has refused to acknowledge the survivors, that has refused to investigate crimes, that has refused to actually bring indictments and prosecutions. And you can tell that the president is feeling the heat because, as we all know, when Donald Trump is under the gun, his recampments and his pushback are often an admission of guilt. And I think we've seen that the last few days.
You viewed the unredacted Epstein files and said that you will name names of rich and powerful figures up to and including presidents whose names you say were improperly redacted by the DOJ. What did you learn from reviewing the files? And will you put those names in the public record if the administration does not allow full transparency?
Absolutely. And I already have. And in fact, I think it's important to know that much of that is already in the public domain. Now, the administration is failing to comply with the Epstein Files Transparency Act. They've only released a small amount of what we think may be a massive amount of documentation and records. But even in the 3 million files that they dumped a few weeks ago, we see lists of names of prominent figures, including the president and other well-known actors in this space. We see FBI tip sheets, partial investigations, and a number of correspondence with Jeffrey Epstein, where the administration chose to redact names. Myself, Thomas Massie, Ro Khanna, and others have been putting names in the public domain. But it's important, we're not prosecutors. We are Congress. We are doing our oversight responsibilities. But it is the Department of Justice's job to investigate and prosecute these crimes. And I know a lot of people are angry and frustrated that the U.S. is not acting, but that is the Department of Justice's job. And that's why we have to continue to put pressure on them.
Well, this week, Leslie Wexner, the billionaire former CEO of Victoria's Secret, who helped Epstein build his wealth, testified before the Oversight Committee. Wexner denied having any personal relationship with Epstein or any knowledge of his crimes, despite being named repeatedly by survivors in the files. So take a listen to some of what he said.
I think the perspective that I have now, and I think what's really important for this group to understand, is that as I look back at it, I was conned by the world Olympic all-time con artist. And you look at, I read in the news all the people he knew, royalty, kings, princes, and all that. An incredible con artist.
So do you trust his testimony? I mean, given the high bar to open a criminal investigation, is the Oversight Committee laying the groundwork perhaps for civil cases to be brought by survivors?
Well, I believe that Wexner actually perjured himself in that interview. He claimed in that interview that the Department of Justice and FBI had never contacted him. And in fact, just last night, I was going through files that are on the Department of Justice's website and found an internal DOJ memo in which prosecutors discussed extensively with the U.S. attorney their contacts with Wexner's attorneys. So he's lying. He is just straight up lying. He's not a credible witness. We know he had a direct relationship. We know that Jeffrey Epstein was managing over $1 billion in assets for him. And so we're going to continue to pursue justice. And it's also important to understand that Mr. Wexner is named as a co-conspirator by the U.S. Department of Justice in their investigations. So, yes, we are bringing forth the evidence so that there can be justice, whether that's through the criminal justice system or through civil lawsuits.
Speaking of justice, you say that your state is acting where the federal government has failed after New Mexico's House of Representatives approved a bipartisan truth commission to investigate allegations of criminal activity at the Zorro Ranch Epstein owned there. You say allegations of sexual abuse at the ranch existed for years, but were never fully investigated by the FBI or local authorities. What are some of those allegations, and why did the state wait until now to open a probe?
Yeah, well, I just want to start by saying I am so deeply proud to be a New Mexican and of the leaders in our state who are stepping up where the federal government has failed, including State House Representative Andre Romero, who really led the charge on getting this Truth Commission passed. And I'm excited to announce that she will be my guest at the State of the Union this year, alongside Epstein survivors who are coming with House and Senate leadership. So we plan to spend the day at the State of the Union focused on the survivors and justice for the survivors. And I'm excited to have Rep. Romero accompany me. But The reason why they move forward with this Truth Commission is that Zorro Ranch is a sprawling ranch here in New Mexico. It's actually not far from where I live. And for many years, there were allegations of sexual assault. There are actual FBI investigations that were done into survivor claims. There are crimes that were never investigated. And with the action of the release and unsealing of documents through the Epstein Files Transparency Act, it's clear that DOJ at some point asked New Mexico's AG to drop its case, but then never followed up on those investigations. And so not only did we pass a Truth Commission to investigate those crimes, but our AG announced a couple of days ago that he will be opening a new case to investigate not just the sexual assault crimes that may have happened on that property, but a potential double homicide that was revealed in the unsealed files.
How does society grapple with the many wealthy and powerful who continued socializing or doing business with Epstein and just look the other way?
Well, I think that is really what is at the heart of this case. I think that what this case reveals is that for many years and many decades, we've had a two-tiered system of justice, well, since the beginning of this country's history, but that it favored the rich and powerful, and it didn't matter what party you belonged to, that you would be shielded from accountability, even from the grossest and most disgusting crimes. And the fact that people who were in positions of power and wealth not only continued to associate with Jeffrey Epstein, but look the other way even after his conviction and knowledge of these crimes came forward, show that there was not only a systemic cover-up and miscarriage of justice inside our institutions, but within the broader society itself. And I really genuinely believe that this is a reckoning moment, that this is beyond just Me Too 2.0, but this is really about how do we hold the rich and powerful accountable and ensure that this kind of exploitation of people can never happen again.
Representative Melanie Stansbury, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.